Netflix's Avatar: The Last Airbender is truly a mixed bag. After watching the entire season twice already, I can confidently say there is a lot to love and a lot to dislike. As an adaptation of one of the best shows ever made, comparisons to the original series are bound to happen. So because the Netflix series follows the same story as the original first season, in this video I'm going to go through each of the 8 episodes and analyze the story decisions that were made and how they compare to the original. How are certain narrative beats adapted? What did the Netflix show change for the worse? What did the Netflix show change for the better? Now, throughout this video, I will be comparing the Netflix show to the animated show a lot. This, however, is not going to be a video pointing out how every change to the source material is bad. What I do on this channel is analyze storytelling techniques and how effective they are. In the case of this show, the original series is almost perfect. So when the Netflix show has some missteps, I want to compare it to the animated show and conclude which version I felt conveyed the message more effectively. For the most part, the animated show did a better job, but again, there are instances where I thought the Netflix show did something better. So don't assume I'm here to criticize everything about the Netflix show. So let's begin. The first episode is titled Aang, and it maybe has the biggest change right off the bat, and that's the opening sequence. The original show began with an opening monologue about the war, with Sokka and Katara's introduction following it. The Netflix show begins in the past with how the 100-year war started and how the air nomads all died. It's really important to note that not all changes are better or worse than the original. We need to keep in mind that the primary audience of both shows is different, and thus different needs have to be met. And again, keep in mind, just because one primary audience is a lot younger than the other, that doesn't mean the story is lesser by any means. The original series is a lot more juvenile than the Netflix one. That does not mean it's worse, that doesn't mean it shouldn't be taken seriously, and that doesn't mean adults can't enjoy it. All it means is that to hook your primary audience, you need to cater to them first. The politics of how a war starts and how a genocide begins is not a great way to begin a show that is directed towards children. It is, however, a really solid way to begin a series with a more mature audience. So with that being said, I love the way the Netflix series begins, for the most part. What I like is that a lot of it doesn't really change the source material. It's a new piece of lore that would work in the animated canon. But I also want to clarify that just because something was changed from the source material, that doesn't mean it's bad. In a perfect world, would I like things to stay the same? Sure. But I also acknowledge that this is a new story with different goals, and just because it is different doesn't mean it is bad. So right away, the series answers a question that the animated show never did. How exactly did the air nomad genocide happen? We learned the Fire Nation created a diversion and used the powers of the comet to attack the Southern Air Temple. I also really liked how the airbenders had a ceremony for the comet, and that allowed all the airbenders to be in one place at once. It's a really good way to explain how every single air nomad was killed so easily. A major reason I like this new opening is that we're allowed to see the brutality of the Fire Nation. Since the original show was a kids show, we were never going to see people burned to death, but throughout the series, a lot of death is shown on screen. This adds to the level of threat of the Fire Nation, and I like that. This is a small thing, but I also like how there's a tangible reason why the air nomads want to rush Aang's training. The Fire Nation is attacking and everyone knows it. In the original show, it's not exactly clear why the air nomads wanted to rush Aang. How do they know the Fire Nation will attack? Are there just whispers of the Fire Nation ramping up its military and the air nomads are aware? It's not a big deal, but something I noticed. In this opening sequence, we also get more development for the Air Nation. We see Aang and Gyatso's relationship right away. We also see how with a brewing war, the air nomads want Aang to begin his training immediately, and this causes Aang to run away. So we get the same narrative beats here that we got in the original episode, The Storm. One thing I would have liked mentioned was how unordinary it is for an avatar to begin his training at the age of 12. That's a really small thing, so I don't mind it not being here, but I really wish it was there. The one change that I felt was completely unnecessary was the reason Aang wasn't there during the attack. The original show, Aang overheard how he was going to be shipped across the world to begin his training. This scared Aang and he ran away so he didn't have to face his responsibilities. In the Netflix version, Aang kinda just goes on a Sky Bison version of a mind-clearing walk and happens to get caught in this storm. What's so peculiar about this change change is that, as you'll see more as the video progresses, the Netflix show tends to focus on the Avatar's role in the world more than the animated show did, at least in season 1. Every episode pretty much tells Aang this is what the Avatar needs to do in this situation, so how will you adapt? The animated show made it a more personal journey for Aang where he learned waterbending and lived out some of his dreams of adventure. So with that being said, you'd think the decision to have Aang run away because he's scared of his responsibility would be even more important for the Netflix show. But because he kinda just went for a walk and got caught up in a storm, his guilt in later episodes doesn't feel the same. It's like if I got into a car accident that killed a person in my passenger seat. Yeah, I'd be devastated. But if I drunk drove and got someone killed, that would hit a lot more personally because I made an immature decision that caused others harm. Aang just wanting to clear his mind is not an immature thing to do. So when people yell at him for disappearing for 100 years, it doesn't feel the same because a character flaw did not lead to all this tragedy. It is very important that your characters suffer the consequences of their flaws. In the original series, Aang's flaws led to the 100-year war, and that forced him to change. Here, he's a victim of an unlucky situation and needs to fix it. In the grand scope of things, it's no different, but for the personal journey of Aang, it's a big deal. So Aang gets frozen in ice and all the airbenders are killed. We flash forward to Katara waterbending, and a lot of how the original show began is played out here. Sokka and Katara go fishing, they run into Aang, Zuko sees the beam, and then Aang gets brought back to the village. I'm gonna talk more about Sokka's sexism arc in the next episode, so don't worry, I'm not ignoring those changes. Overall, I don't mind the differences in this opening episode. Aang waking up and asking Katara if she wants to go penguin sledding wouldn't really work here, so I don't mind that it's not here. One of my biggest criticisms of the show is often the dialogue, and it's really prevalent in this first episode. As we all know, the original series was 20 episodes of roughly 20 minutes each, and this series has 8 episodes of roughly 55 minutes each. Even though in totality their runtimes are roughly the same, the amount of episodes still matters. Because there were 20 episodes in the animated series, the writers are able to have the characters travel to more places. They can use the break between episodes to mask the passage of time, allowing characters to jump from place to place. Because the Netflix show is only 8 episodes, even though they are longer, you can't have characters visiting all these different places because if they went to 3 different locations in one episode, that would be terrible pacing for an episode. So what this means is that the Netflix show needs to cram a lot more important plot points and character moments into the same story arc, and often that means it's kinda rushed. Also, because the writers chose to adapt the backstory of the storm into a 20-minute opening sequence, that means there is less time for them to adapt the original first 3 episodes into the remaining 35 minutes of Netflix's first episode. For example, with Zuko, we don't learn that he was banished until episode 3. In the first 2 episodes, he just yells about restoring his honor. But here, since they are cutting some of the more intimate character moments out from the original show, they have scenes where Zuko spells out his entire backstory to the audience. Like when he's talking to Iroh and he yells, "I am the banished prince, so I must find the Avatar so I can go home and end my banishment." This scene feels like Zuko is talking to the audience more than it feels like Zuko is talking to Iroh. And there are a lot of other moments like that with Aang, Katara, and Sokka, where they kinda just mention their backstory and their motivations instead of the subtle ways it was conveyed in the original show. Like Aang asking Iroh why the war started. This isn't discussed until much later in the original series. Also, when Gran is narrating the events of the history of the war, she tells Aang how all the air nomads are gone. We see that Aang is upset, but it's not the same as him actually finding out they're all gone by going to the Southern Air Temple and seeing they're all dead. This show has a big exposition problem, and this first episode has a lot of that. So that would be my largest criticism of this first episode, the clunky dialogue. I will give the Netflix show credit. The locations here are spectacular. I like how the Southern Water Tribe is more expansive than in the original show. The Southern Air Temple looks great, and the characters all look great too. One criticism I will disagree with is that the Netflix show lacks the heart of Avatar. Sure, Aang isn't as playful as his animated counterpart, but I don't mind that. I don't mind seeing a slightly more mature Aang. And frankly, the Netflix show still has a lot of Aang's goofy kid moments. It even has Sokka's sense of humor, which I love. So even though the dialogue and even the acting is a bit clunky at times, it captures the heart of Avatar, and that's why I can't say this show is terrible. But there's still a lot more to discuss, so let's move on to episode 2. Episode 2 is pretty much a 45-minute long adaptation of the Kyoshi Warriors episode. The original episode was a Sokka-focused episode, so I want to focus on him and his relationship with Suki first. What I really liked in this episode is how they developed Suki a lot more than the original series did. Here they gave Suki this characteristic where she feels isolated from the world and resents her mother for not letting her see it. In season 2, if she does go to help the refugees, it would be a nice continuation of that arc. I also really loved how her having this sheltered life turned her into kind of a dork. She shows interest in Sokka because he's an outsider, so when she interacts with him, she comes across as awkward. Like when she stares at Sokka shirtless, or the scene by the lake where they're training. I loved that scene. Suki's such a dork with the way she sneaks up on Sokka and fights him. I don't know why, but I died of laughter when Sokka just walks away like he's fed up with Suki. What the Netflix show does well is set up plot points in the future. Because it has the hindsight of knowing what happens in seasons 2 and 3, it's able to set up some things very well. Like as I mentioned, Suki potentially traveling the world, and even something with Zuko that I'll mention later. So I really liked what they did with Suki. They didn't take away anything from the original character, but they also humanized her and gave her more personality. Hot take, but Suki isn't three-dimensional in the original series. She's just this competent warrior. I liked Suki in season 2 where she opened up about her feelings towards Sokka, but the decision the Netflix show made with her wanting to see the world was a decision I really liked. When it comes to Sokka, the absence of his sexism arc is really felt here. One thing this show gets right about Sokka is his desire to become a leader. He wants to be like his dad, who was a great leader, and therefore he wants to prove to the world that he can be just like his father. One thing I thought the first episode missed out on was showing Sokka's incompetence. In the original show, no one takes him seriously, and he doesn't even have a fight with Zuko. He just gets knocked over. He was completely embarrassed. Here they made him a bit more confident. Like when he fights Zuko, he doesn't win, but he also holds his own a little bit and is able to flee on his own accord. The reason Sokka was so incompetent in the original first few episodes was because it made him being humbled by Suki a lot more satisfying. So even if the writers didn't want Sokka to be sexist in the beginning, they should have made him a lot more incompetent so Suki can still humble him. In the Netflix show, he is somewhat competent and somewhat smart to begin the show. Like the reason he wants to train with Suki, other than that he has a crush on her, is because he instantly respects her as a warrior and wants to learn more. I thought it would have been a lot more powerful if Sokka still wanted to one-up Suki as the leader of his village and then got beat up by her where he was humbled. That would still tie in nicely to his arc in the show. So that was a missed opportunity. Sokka's arc in these first 2 episodes is an example where the writers understand the character from the animated show, but they took away some plot points that turned Sokka from a good character to a great character. So in these early episodes, I like Sokka and his arc, I just don't love it. Moving on from Sokka and Suki, this episode continues to develop Aang. The main focus of this episode for Aang appears to be hammering home the message that he can't run away from his responsibility. Kyoshi tells him that many more will die if he does not save them. This all works and is an important part of Aang's story. It just goes back to what I said in the first episode. Aang never ran away from his responsibility. He went for a short flight with Appa and got unlucky. There's this great scene where Aang buries Gyatso. I loved that moment and it was a great addition to the show. Aang shows his guilt for not being there for the Airbenders and he cries. It was great, but imagine how much better it would be if Aang actually ran away from his responsibilities and Gyatso died because of Aang's flaws. I'm going to repeat myself a lot in this video because that one decision in the original series made Aang's arc so much better, but I'll try my best not to talk about it that much. A small change that I do like for Aang's arc is Kyoshi Island's view of outsiders. Because of the war, the people of Kyoshi Island have isolated themselves. Aang mentions how people used to always help each other, but clearly now they don't because they're scared of the war. And because they've isolated themselves, some of the younger people like Suki have a desire to see the world. I liked that change because it shows Aang another consequence of his absence, and that ties into his arc about responsibility. Also, to those who say this show gets Aang wrong, just watch this scene where he plays with the other kids. Just because they changed some aspects of his arc, that doesn't mean they still didn't nail the character. I love seeing him on the airball, so don't say this isn't Aang. Aang inevitably talks to Kyoshi, and I like this change. One thing this show does well is how different Roku, Kyoshi, and Kuruk are from each other. The original series mostly just showed Roku, so I like that they had the other past avatars show up too. Also, the writers really did their research on the lore. Like they mentioned Kyoshi's backstory of her being an orphan and working for rich people. That comes directly from the Rise of Kyoshi book, which I've read. So I I appreciated the extra lore, but it's one of those things that only hardcore fans would appreciate. The casual viewer wouldn't recognize it, and moments like that happen a lot throughout the show. Oh, and seeing Kyoshi fight was awesome. One big change that the Netflix show made was the reason to go to the North Pole. Originally, it was so Aang and Katara could learn waterbending. Here they go because Aang is told something bad will happen and only he can save them. I'm neutral about this change. It doesn't really affect Aang all that much. In the original show, the urgency comes from the comet and Aang needing to learn all the elements. That urgency is still here, he just needs to save the water tribe first. It does take away from him needing to learn waterbending, but I'll touch on that later. The biggest negative for this change is how it affects Katara, but I'm going to dive into that in the next episode. Lastly, I'll talk about Zuko. Of all of the main characters, they nailed Zuko the best. The entire story of Zuko wanting to find the Avatar so he can return home is still there and it's still great. The Netflix show puts more of an emphasis on Zuko wanting the throne too, and I like that change. It makes sense. Losing his right as heir is kind of the ultimate sign of dishonor, so he doesn't want that to happen. Another change I did really like is the emphasis of hope. Zuko has this nice moment where he talks about how it's scarier now that the Avatar has been found because there's real hope he can go home. The reason I like this change so much is because of how it turns out at the end of the season. Zhao telling Zuko that he never had a chance to return home and that it was all a ploy just to motivate Azula is an excellent addition in my book. Remember a few minutes ago I mentioned how the storytellers can plant more seeds because they know the direction of the story? Having Zuko's hope destroyed at the end of season 1 ties nicely into his arc in season 2, assuming they go down that route. This show also just nailed his relationship with Iroh. Certain moments like when Iroh is talking about the food and Zuko getting frustrated is just so Iroh. One change I was not a fan of was the changes to Zhao and his relationship with Zuko. In the Netflix show, Zhao is a lot more discreet with his motivations. Like he says he'll work with Zuko but plans on stabbing him in the back. In the original series, he's flatly an antagonist to Zuko right away. He's also a lot more confident, so I just like animated Zhao better. But I was really disappointed that they took away Zhao's Agni Kai with Zuko. In the original series, Zuko had 3 Agni Kais, one with his father in the flashback, one with Zhao, and then one with Azula. In all 3, Zuko is the one who shows honor and his opponent shows dishonor. That is a really important plot point because it shows us how Zuko is being manipulated into being this villainous self instead of being his true nature. So taking that moment away with excluding his fight with Zhao was disappointing. Overall, despite missing a few things, they nailed Zuko, and this second episode is a good example of that. Episode 3 is titled Omashu, and funny enough, it isn't really an adaptation of the Omashu episode from the animated series. Here we get an adaptation of the Jet episode and the Northern Air Temple episode. Before I dive deep into each part of the episode and how it affects our characters, I want to address why I find these middle episodes to be the weaker parts of the season. For me at least, the charm of the original series stemmed from Team Avatar. Their bond is what made the original show so special. Throughout the first season, Aang, Sokka, and Katara went on adventure after adventure together where they all became close and they really felt like a family. Of course, since the original series has 20 episodes in its first season, it had time to devote certain episodes to certain characters. There are specific episodes that unquestionably highlight specific characters, but because there were so many episodes, the rest of Team Avatar was there in the background when the spotlight character got to shine. In the Netflix version of the show, they take multiple episodes from the original series and try to condense them into one longer episode. As I said before, they took the Jet episode and the Northern Air Temple episode and combined them together. In theory, that could work, but what happens is that our main characters get separated. Katara is with Jet, Sokka is with Sai, and Aang is with Teo. What happens here is that it takes moments away from Team Avatar being together and forming that bond. I'm not going to go as far as saying that they don't feel close at all. There are a handful of moments where they do bond and it does make them feel closer. It's just that the show doesn't take that next step to make them feel like a true family. Thankfully, there are still 2 more seasons, hopefully, so they can continue to allow the team to grow. I want to switch over to talking about Katara because I haven't really spoken about her yet. Of all the characters, I would say Katara is the one that is adapted the poorest. My biggest issue is that the Netflix show makes decisions that robs Katara of a lot of her agency. In the original series, the core of Katara was pretty simple. As a little girl, her mother died, and 2 things stemmed from this. One was that she felt helpless, helpless, and in order to never feel helpless again, she wanted to become a master waterbender. The other was that she had to take on a mother role responsibility in the absence of her mom. Pretty much every action Katara makes in the series stems from one of those two things. In the Netflix show, they kinda removed the entire part of Katara being motherly. One example was when Aang entered the Avatar state in the Southern Air Temple. Katara was the one who was there and calmed him down. In the Netflix show, Katara doesn't have that moment. Aang calms down on his own, and then Katara comforts Aang. Throughout the rest of season 1, Katara doesn't have any other chances to be motherly or show her gigantic heart. One of the episodes that wasn't adapted at all was the Haru episode. Even though that episode wasn't that good, it was a Katara-focused episode that showed us her strength. Because it was cut, we are missing that part of Katara's story. The other part of her arc was wanting to become a bender so she never feels helpless. In the Netflix show, I don't feel like that's part of her character. Sure, her mother's death is important, but instead of being the reason she wants to be a strong bender, it's more of something that hinders her from being a strong bender. She has to overcome that mental block, and once she does, she becomes stronger. That's fine and all, but by changing Katara's motivations, she doesn't appear to have a deeply rooted reason why she wants to become a waterbender. It appears to me that she wants to become a stronger bender because it's a part of her culture, which is fine, I guess, but that's not as interesting as wanting to be a bender so she never feels helpless. So that is the crux of my biggest issue with Katara. They changed her motivations. Now in this episode, they make her the focus of the Jet storyline. They did Jet very well. He's exactly like he was before, and the extremist part of the war is dissected and makes for an interesting commentary on the effects of war. My issue, however, is that the Jet episode was more important to Sokka's story, not Katara's. Sure, Katara lets her guard down around Jet and gets burned because of it, but from my perspective, the whole point of the Jet episode was to contrast Jet and Sokka. Jet may be more competent than Sokka, but Jet is also someone who has destructive behaviors and doesn't protect the innocents. By the end of the episode, Sokka shows that he is the better leader because he doesn't harm innocent people. That part of the Jet story is completely absent in the Netflix episode. Sokka barely interacts with Jet and therefore doesn't highlight his leadership skills. So even though Katara is front and center with the Jet story, it doesn't advance her character that much because it wasn't designed to. So yeah, I liked Jet and the portrayal of all the freedom fighters, but the impact on our characters wasn't felt as much as it should have been. Moving on from Katara, let's go back to Sokka. Sokka here spends a lot of time with the Mechanist. He gives his input on the creation of the hot air balloon, and it's just like the original show. I get the vibe though that the message the storytellers wanted to convey was that being a warrior isn't Sokka's true calling. Engineering is. That is an interesting point of view. I don't know if I can say I dislike that. It's another example of the show just being different. However, Sokka's arc in the Netflix show is more about being a leader than it is being a warrior. Sokka having other skills like his engineering prowess was a part of what made him a great leader. It wasn't his defining characteristic. So I didn't love what they did with Sokka here, but I can't say I hate it either. The last point I want to touch on before moving to episode 4 is the introduction of Azula. Azula, as we all know, wasn't really in season 1 of the original series, so I was curious to see how they would include her here. And I gotta say, I love what they added here. I know a lot of people aren't a fan of her portrayal, but I completely disagree. We briefly see Azula undercover in a scene with these Fire Nation rebels. It's not touched on too much, but I do love that concept, that there are people in the Fire Nation that want to end the war. We also get to see Azula's cunning and mind for strategy that makes her a serious threat. What I really liked, however, is that they showed her insecurities early on. A lot of people felt in the original show that Azula's mental collapse was rushed, and I can see that. So what the Netflix show decided to do is plant those seeds of insecurity all the way from the start. Finding out Zuko found the Avatar made Azula very insecure. She takes pride in being the favorite child, and when there's a hint that Ozai is proud of Zuko, we see how she reacts. I'm probably not going to touch on Azula again because she's not shown here much, but I liked that they showed her insecurities early on. This way, if in season 3 when Mei betrays Azula for Zuko and Ozai tells her she can't help in the final battle, we better understand why she would have that mental collapse. Also, when we find out that Ozai was just motivating Azula this whole time, it shows how much of a prick he is and how abusive that is towards a child. So overall, I really liked Azula's addition in this season. Episode 3 had some highs and it had some lows, but let's move on to episode 4 and see how they handled the Boomy storyline. Before continuing on with the rest of this video, only 6.5% of viewers are subscribed to this channel. So if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you. Episode 4 has 3 storylines going on at once. There is the Aang and Bumi storyline, there's the Katara and Sokka in the cave storyline, and then there's Zuko rescuing Iroh. Let's start with Aang and Bumi. I don't know if this is a hot take or not because I'm not super familiar with other people's opinions on the show, but for the most part, I really liked the changes here. The original Omashu episode was one of my least favorite episodes. I did a ranking video on all 61 episodes of the original series, and in that ranking, I'm pretty sure I put Omashu in the bottom 5. My main reason was because Bumi's lessons didn't add much to this story. It was all some game for Aang to remember who Bumi was, and it had no impact on Aang's journey for the rest of the season. Here, the mystery around who Bumi is resolved rather quickly. The rest of the episode focuses on Bumi trying to teach Aang a lesson. The storytellers promised that the adaptation would be a slightly more mature version of the animated series, and Bumi's character is an example of that. Bumi is still goofy like he was in the original series, but here he is another person added to the list of people who resent Aang for disappearing. I'll be honest, I find that to be totally realistic. In the first episode, Gran recites the classic Avatar opening, almost as if it's a tale inside the universe. I would be pretty pissed too if I was a king and my people suffered for 100 years because the Avatar was gone. So seeing Bumi reflect that sentiment was something I enjoyed. The main lesson from this storyline, however, is that Bumi is trying to teach Aang that there will be no easy answers. Will you feed an orphanage or the soldiers? That's an example he uses. At the end, Bumi gives Aang an ultimatum that he has to choose between saving himself or saving Bumi. Aang gets bailed out, of course, by Katara, but the message still stands. Aang then gives this speech that he won't just rely on himself, he'll rely on his friends too. And that's who Aang is to me. He cares about his friends and isn't afraid to rely on them. So I liked that addition. Frankly, this whole scene was better here than it was in the animated show. Bumi's lessons actually meant something and allowed Aang to shine and show some growth. The second storyline to discuss is Katara and Sokka in the secret tunnels. Frankly, there isn't much to discuss here. As we all know, the whole Cave of Lovers episode wasn't even in season 1 of the original series. I can respect that they found a way to adapt it here, knowing they would probably skip it in season 2, but recontextualizing the love scene from romantic love to sibling love was a bit weird. I liked seeing Katara and Sokka bond for a bit. As you guys know, I love scenes where two characters have personal conversations, but this raises a question. Does Aang have a crush on Katara in the Netflix show? Like, right from the first episode in the original series, Aang had a big crush on her. It was highlighted again in the Fortune Teller episode, and the Cave of Two Lovers episode resulted in them likely kissing. There is not a shred of evidence to suggest that Aang has a crush on Katara here. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but Aang's crush on Katara is kinda a big part of this story. So I'm curious to see if that becomes important in season 2 or season 3. But going back to Katara and Sokka, it was a fine addition to this story. I liked hearing the music though, I'll say that. Now the last part of the episode to discuss is Zuko saving Iroh, and this story is the most similar to the original series. I like how instead of having Iroh just get captured like he did in the original series, they have him sacrifice himself for Zuko. It's not a big deal, but it's another example of showing us how much Zuko matters to Iroh. What made the original scene of this so great is that Zuko chose to save Iroh over keep chasing the Avatar, and here he makes that same choice, so I'm glad they kept that in. Another great addition would be the development of the Earth Kingdom guards. One of them vents to Iroh about his time during the siege of Ba Sing Se and how he lost his brother there. I wonder if they added this because they're changing Iroh's arc. Let me explain. In the original series, Iroh does have an arc. He goes from becoming a conqueror to learning what truly matters in life. The loss of his son changed that perspective for him, and he wasn't too invested in the war anymore. That whole arc happens before the series even begins, and we get hints of that arc throughout the show. I wonder if here they're gonna have Iroh go on that arc during the show. Obviously he's not a conqueror anymore, and he's certainly mellowed out, but I wonder if he hasn't fully abandoned the war yet. Whenever Aang asks him questions about the war, he says it's not that simple. I wonder if this scene here is going to change Iroh's mind about the war, where he wants nothing to do with it in season 2. We'll see, I guess. But either way, I loved the humanization of the Earth Kingdom soldiers and how it fleshed out those who suffered during a war. In this episode, we also get the Lu Ten flashbacks and how that affected Iroh. What I really loved here is that we actually see Iroh in the past. In the original series, we don't get many flashbacks of Iroh other than a few shots. I love that we saw Iroh at Lu Ten's funeral, but most importantly, they showed us how Zuko comforted him. What happens here isn't new to the Avatar world. We know the story of why Zuko means so much to Iroh and how the death of his son influenced that, but they conveyed the same story bit here in a different way, and it's equally as effective. The show continues to nail Iroh and Zuko's relationship, and all the flashbacks between Zuko and Iroh are evidence of that. Episode 4 has a lot to like. Iroh's story is of course first one of them. Aang and Bumi's story was quite new and I liked it, and Sokka and Katara going through the caves was fine. Overall, it was a solid episode. Episode 5 is the episode that makes the most amount of changes, I would say. Sure, there's some stuff here with Zuko finding June and then Azula training, but it's not much, so I'm not going to dive into that. The main focus is on Aang, Katara, and Sokka entering the spirit world. In the original series, after seeing the destroyed forest, Aang helps a village by helping Heibai. Here, a lot more happens. Right off the bat, I want to say I don't mind these changes at all. The original episode was the Winter Solstice two-parter, and even though those episodes were fine, there was nothing there that was of major importance to me, and the stuff that was important is still adapted here. So do I mind that they made a big change? Not really. In this episode, the gang gets trapped in the fog of lost souls. For those of you who don't know what this is actually something taken from the Legend of Korra. As far as I'm aware, this is the only connection to the Legend of Korra. So Aang and company run into a bunch of monsters, including Wang Shi Tong. That's kind of unnecessary, but again, it's not the end of the world. The real highlight of this episode comes towards the second half. Katara and Sokka relive some tragic memories, and Aang talks to Gyatso. With Katara, we already know the story, and they adapted it well here. But I do want to add how much of a difference it makes that Katara actually watched her mother die. There's a big difference between hearing that a relative died and actually seeing their murder. Katara watched her mother burn. I cannot imagine how traumatizing that is. When we look back at the Jet episode where Katara was mentally blocked because of the past, I can totally get it. I may not have been a fan of that story point in that Jet episode, but I still get it. There's also this moment where Katara is talking to her mom and Gran. Her mom tells Katara that she will become a powerful bender one day so she can help people. So this is another piece of motivation for Katara. Her mother wanted her to become a bender, so that's part of the reason why she does it. I still much prefer Katara's motivation stemming from her helplessness, but at least there's more there than what I mentioned before. When it comes to Sokka's flashbacks, they're quite different from what the original animated series did. In the original show, what motivated Sokka was that he wanted to be like his dad, and the fact that he was left behind made him feel inadequate. Here we actually get a lot more. Sokka took his ice dodging trial and he passed, but afterwards he overhears his father saying he's disappointed and that Sokka is not meant to be a leader. I really liked this change for Sokka's story. In a way, it mirrors Zuko's story as well. Both characters are now motivated by gaining their father's approval back after disappointing them. The whole reason Sokka acts the way he does is because of this moment from his father, and I also find it totally realistic. A child could definitely be haunted by hearing their parents say they are disappointed in them. No one wants to hear that. So in the end, I liked this change for Sokka. The last part of the episode follows Aang. Unlike Katara and Sokka, Aang is able to resist the traumatic flashback and instead talks to a ghost of Gyatso. I'm not entirely sure what exactly Gyatso is here. In the Avatar lore, no one has been able to talk to the spirit of dead people besides the older avatars. I guess if you watched The Legend of Korra, you can say this is like Iroh in that series, where he's dead but his spirit remains in the spirit world, but I'm not here to complain about the logistics of Avatar ghosts. There's a lot of solid character work with Aang in not only this scene, but the entire episode. Aang talks about feeling lost. He doesn't really know what he's doing when it comes to the spirits. When it comes to saving the waterbenders, he has no clue how he's going to do that either. This was something I'm glad they kept from the original show. Aang admitting he doesn't know what he's doing and that he's not perfect. The scene ends with this powerful moment where Gyatso tells Aang it's not his fault. And that's another powerful moment for me. Kids often beat themselves up for stuff that happened to them. Look at Zuko. He believes that his banishment was his fault. It's not. It's his abusive father's fault. So I really liked that Gyatso tells Aang there was nothing he could have done. For the 10th time, this scene would have been much more powerful if Aang actually avoided his duties instead of clearing his mind, but I still think the scene works regardless. This episode didn't have much happening. If anything, it was solely a character-focused episode. And even though a lot of it was just replaying stuff us Avatar fans already know, keep in mind there are newer viewers, and to them I'm sure this episode had a lot of powerful moments. Overall, I didn't mind the changes. I was either completely neutral on the changes or I really like them. Episode 6 is a big Zuko and Iroh episode, but I do want to talk about Aang briefly. In this episode, Aang goes to Roku's temple and also gets captured by Zhao and subsequently rescued by Zuko. If you were to list this episode out as bullet points, I don't have a problem with any of the changes. I don't mind them combining Roku's temple, June, and the Blue Spirit stuff into one episode. So I should like these episodes, but something just feels off to me. And I've come to the conclusion that the show doesn't have any subtlety when it comes to the dialogue, especially with Aang. I've lost count of the amount of times Aang yells out that he needs to save his friends and that he can't let the world down again. Like, I get it. I know this is a major part of your arc. I don't need to be reminded every 5 minutes. This episode is also completely devoid of Sokka and Katara. I mentioned this before and I'll mention it again. Aang, Sokka, and Katara need to spend time together. It's one thing if they don't spend much time together in a 20-minute episode out of a 20-episode season, but it's another thing when they don't spend time together in a 50-minute episode of an 8-episode season. To make up for this, the show tries to add little moments of humor between the group. Like oftentimes Sokka makes a comment and then Katara teases him. I don't know if it's the acting or the direction, but it just doesn't feel the same. So even though Aang clearly shows heart throughout the season, I'm not as invested in Team Avatar. I also have one minor nitpick that I want to share. How did June and Nyla get to Roku's island? Can Nyla swim? Regardless, with that out of the way, I still stand by the fact that the show nailed Zuko and Iroh. This episode pretty much features a more expanded version of what happened when Zuko was banished. I really liked the opening of this episode. We see how Zuko was before. He's this kind, optimistic kid, and then it transitions into the present day where he's this angry brat. It's a good way to show how much damage had been done to him mentally. Then we go to the war room scene, and I like the little bits they added to expand this scene specifically, like Zuko not being super familiar with war tactics and embarrassing himself in front of his father. I also liked how Zuko doubled down on his belief of the plan being a terrible one, but sometimes certain scenes shouldn't play out fully. Like originally after Zuko speaks out, we just get Iroh's monologue saying he was told to fight in an Agni Kai. Here seeing Ozai yell enough and then demand an Agni Kai felt a little weird. Now we get to the Agni Kai scene and I take issue with these changes. So here Zuko fights back and gets shamed by his father because he had a chance to injure his dad but chose not to, and this is what led to his banishment. So it kind of reshapes this scene from Zuko being banished because he disrespected his father and showed weakness to Zuko being banished because he showed compassion and mercy. That's not an end of the world change, but the part I took issue with was Zuko not only fighting back, but also putting up a fight against Ozai. With the original scene, Zuko did not fight back. He just laid there and got punished for it. That scene did not sugarcoat at all how abusive it was. This father challenged his maybe 12-year-old son to a duel, knowing full well Zuko had no chance to defend himself. There was no denying how brutal and abusive Ozai was. By having Zuko fight back and put up a fight, it takes away from that element of abuse. Like sure, Ozai still burned Zuko, but it's not the same when you're injuring someone who is on your skill level. So the Netflix scene portrays this moment as toxic, tough love rather than the child abuse it really is. So I did not like that change at all. But funny enough, this led into maybe the best change of the entire series, and that was the lore building with the 41st Division. The Netflix show makes an active attempt to humanize Zuko's crew. This one guy, Lieutenant G, is commonly shown throughout the season. The change to make Zuko's crew the same people that would have been sacrificed was a perfect addition to the story. The moment after Iroh tells G this, and then they all salute Zuko, was maybe one of the best scenes in the season. I absolutely loved that addition to the story. Moving on, a good portion of the episode is devoted to adapting the Blue Spirit storyline, and it was done pretty faithfully. I loved the motivations behind the original scene, and it's all present here too. In the Netflix adaptation, they put even more emphasis on how risky this is for Zuko, like how this place is in Fire Nation territory and that is considered treason for Zuko to trespass, or how this was a highly guarded facility. Zuko risking his life so he can potentially gain his honor back is great. Actually, now that I mention it, Zuko doesn't mention his honor ever in this show, I believe. It appears his focus is mostly on claiming his rightful place on the throne rather than restoring his honor, and I think that's a weaker change. The honor part of it for Zuko is a lot more personal. Honor is something that intrinsically motivates you, while wanting the throne is extrinsic motivation. So that's another example of a slight change that didn't do the show any favors. The episode ends with Zuko and Aang bonding for a little bit, and I'm not sure I like that. The Netflix show makes an effort to have Aang empathize with Zuko. Aang sees Zuko as a human being who's damaged. He even reiterates that in the beginning of episode 7. The original show only had one moment where Aang empathized with Zuko before his redemption, and that that was immediately ended with Zuko deciding to shoot a fire blast at him. The reason I prefer there to be no empathy between these two is it makes Zuko have to earn his redemption even more later on. When Zuko shows up to the gang in season 3, none of them should have any reason to trust Zuko, so Zuko has to individually earn all their trust so he can become a part of the group. But here, since Aang already knows Zuko is a damaged kid, it makes his redemption easier in my eyes, and I don't want it to be easier. Redemption should be hard, something that should be worked for. So even though it's solid relationship building between these two, I don't think that relationship should be built yet. This episode had a lot of highs and a lot of lows. The highs being the changes to the 41st Division, and the lows being the lack of Sokka and Katara, along with Zuko fighting back in his Agni Kai. Episode 7 does a lot to develop the Northern Water Tribe, so let's discuss. A good portion of the episode is devoted to Aang and what he learned from Roku. All the avatars have told Aang that he needs to save the world on his own and that his friends are liabilities. They use an example from Kuruk's backstory where he lost the love of his life to Ko, and he doesn't want Aang to suffer the same pain. Aang then proceeds to tell his friends that they shouldn't fight and that he can't protect them. This is certainly an interesting arc to give Aang, that he needs to reject all of the former avatars' opinions and embrace his friendships. I'm not sure how I feel about this. I certainly get that Aang is confused about a lot of things, so he's more vulnerable to bad advice. I'm not gonna say it doesn't make sense, because that is certainly something someone like Aang in this situation would struggle with. Maybe I'm just letting my biases and my love for the original show cloud my opinion here. One decision that the Netflix show has decided to make that is quite baffling is not progressing Aang along his waterbending training at all. Unless you include harnessing the power of the ocean spirit, not once in the season does Aang bend any water. This was such a jarring decision. The entire reason the Avatar is an important person is because they can bend all the elements. Sure, the Avatar has other responsibilities like keeping the peace in the world, but again, the reason the Avatar has those responsibilities is because they can bend all the elements. Here's what I'm afraid is going to happen. Since the actors are going to age before season 2, there's going to be a time jump, maybe a year or so. In that time frame, Aang will have learned waterbending, and then we will begin season 2. This is a cheap way to advance Aang's skills. We should see the natural progression of a poor waterbender to a master. There were also plenty of scenes where Katara was practicing her waterbending. Why couldn't Aang practice with her? I liked when Pakku told Aang he should have focused on his training, cause I agree. I mentioned this way earlier in the video, how the Netflix show focuses far more on what the Avatar means to the world over just mastering the elements. That's a fine decision, but you don't need to completely ignore Aang's training in the other elements. This is one of the most jarring decisions made in the series, and I hope season 2 learns from that mistake. I want to move on and talk about Katara, because her portrayal still doesn't work for me. She's more active here, but whether or not it's the acting or the directing, she just doesn't have that passion in her. I don't need to see her talk about fighting Pakku over with Sokka. The second she found out women aren't allowed to fight, she would have challenged him right then and there. Sure, her fight scene with Pakku was nice. I even like the change where she initially learns healing from the other women, but again, Katara just lacks that passion that I wish she had. The last major part of this episode is the development of Yue and her relationship with Sokka. This might be another hot take, but I like it a lot more here than I did in the original series. In the animated show, I did not like Yue at all. She was this passive girl who was defined by her wishy-washiness about spending time with Sokka. I found her annoying, and I didn't see what Sokka saw in her. They added so much to Yue here that makes her a more dynamic character and one with agency. Her backstory is the same, with her being saved by the moon spirit, but she's able to access the spirit world. Yeah, that scene with her as a fox was kinda out of place, but I like this change, I'm sorry. It adds character to Yue. Also, when it was revealed that she broke off her engagement with Han, I was so happy. Not because I dislike Han, but because we weren't going to get any of that childish behavior that we got in the animated series. And again, it's another example of Yue having agency with her life. She's also a waterbender here, which is a minuscule change that I don't mind at all. One could argue that Yue's passiveness was a big part of her character, because when she makes the decision to give her life to the moon spirit, it's the first time she's broken free of that passiveness, and if you feel that way, that's awesome, but I far prefer this version of Yue. One that has charm, she's a spiritual leader, someone that the people in the village can look up to. I loved the changes to Yue, except I guess her wig, which doesn't look good at all. I also love the scene where Sokka first chats with Yue and he's a nervous wreck. It's not close to what the original scene was was like, but they still captured that dorky yet lovable nature about Sokka. Sokka and Zuko continue to be the standout characters in this show. They not only feel the most like their animated counterparts, but they feel like the most three-dimensional characters in the show. This episode pretty much was an extended version of the Northern Water Tribe episode in the animated show. They greatly, and I mean greatly, enhanced Yue as a character. They continued to make Sokka this goofy kid that he is, but they also made some questionable decisions with Aang, and they still missed the mark with Katara. The finale of Season 1 of Netflix's Avatar: The Last Airbender is the Battle of the Northern Water Tribe. Right off the bat, I thought this battle was a visual marvel. Here they were greatly able to enhance the scale of the battle. We got these wide shots of the outer wall and the Fire Nation fleet. Also, the Spirit Oasis being this larger, more beautiful cavern in the mountains was a change I really liked. I haven't spoken much about the VFX or the cinematography in this video because I usually just like to discuss storytelling, but it is undeniable that the production did a great job with most of it. There was never a point where the bending looked fake to me, and the locations were also really well done. So I want to give this season, and especially this episode, the credit it deserves on that front. When it comes to the story beats of the episode, most of it is quite similar, but the absence of Zuko abducting Aang is noticeable, and I don't mind that. Aang finding Ko for advice was not something I found to be a critical part of the original battle, so I don't mind that they removed it. What is missing though is Zuko's monologue about Azula and his childhood. It was a powerful monologue, but they can totally give that to Zuko at any other moment in the future of the series, so I don't mind that it's not here. I want to take a moment to discuss Aang in this episode because after watching the series twice, I'm not sure if this was supposed to be the climax of an arc for him. So all season Aang has been burdened with the role of the Avatar, and all the previous Avatars told him to do these things alone. When the Moon Spirit is dead, Aang reflects on these teachings and that motivates him to sacrifice himself to the Ocean Spirit. It's the culmination of him accepting the Avatar's teachings and giving himself up for the greater good. Although, the story frames this as a bad thing, like Aang is losing his humanity. Katara yells out to him that she needs him, and the implication is that he hears her. But what takes Aang out of Koizilla mode is that the Moon Spirit was brought back to life. So Aang didn't make a decision here after he became Koizilla. After the battle, Aang is saddened by all the death and destruction, and then Sokka and Katara give him a little pep talk and all is good. I'm not sure if or how this ties into an arc of Aang embracing his friendships. Let me know down below if I missed something. Besides that, there aren't any other major differences between this and the animated version of the battle. Zhao still kills the Moon Spirit, Yue still sacrifices herself, not much else changes. I do want to highlight a few minor things though. I like how Pakku had a bit of an arc here. In the original series, after he fights Katara, he just decides to change the tradition of women fighting. Here it's a bit more gradual where the other women want to fight too, and then he apologizes to Katara after the battle. It was a small change, but one I thought improved on the character of Pakku. Zhao is the same, but I hate that he started spewing his desire to become Fire Lord. I have no clue how conquering the North would lead to him overthrowing Ozai. It kinda made him comically evil. I mentioned this earlier in the video, but I did like the change that Zuko had this false hope in never returning home because Ozai was just using that to motivate Azula. Sure, the second season is going to have to begin a bit differently, but I like how this destroys Zuko. I think it ties perfectly into his season 2 arc of losing hope, and then Iroh guiding him after that. So that was a welcome change. I also briefly want to touch on Katara's skill levels. People are saying that she mastered waterbending way too quickly. I am baffled by this claim because that is the exact same case in the original series. The only difference is that we get one extra scene in the original show of her training. It's like right after she gets there, she becomes great at waterbending. The only other thing the show did differently was people calling Katara a master. Sure, I can get behind that people probably shouldn't be calling her that, but if you watched the original show, you would see Katara progress in her training at the exact same rate as the Netflix show. The last thing I'll mention is the aftermath of the battle. I really appreciated that the storytellers took the time to show the consequences of the battle. We see all the destruction caused, and we even see that Han and the other kid died. Because the original show was more of a kid show, they would never show something like this. So I was glad that the Netflix version took advantage of its more mature platform. This might be heresy that I'm about to say, but there's a debate in my mind of which version of this battle I liked better, the Netflix one or the animated one. I always need to remind myself that just because something is different, that does not mean it's bad. I would say the writing of the original was better, but the overall presentation of the battle was better in the Netflix version. The season for me ended on a stronger note. Sure, I didn't love everything, as you guys can tell, but I didn't love everything about the original battle either. Overall, the Siege of the North was wonderfully presented with a bit of clumsy writing. So, Netflix's Avatar: The Last Airbender. What are my final thoughts? Easily the show's biggest weakness is the writing. A lot of the dialogue is straight bad at times, and the way certain plot points were executed was not the best. But this show captured a lot of the heart of Avatar. I liked most of the characters. I felt like I was put back into the world of the Four Nations. So, was it worth it? I don't know. Sure. As said in the title of this video, it is mediocre. Mediocre does not mean bad, it means it was of adequate quality. Because the original show is one of the best shows ever made, a mediocre adaptation is a disappointment. But the show was not a disaster. Do you like this adaptation of Avatar: The Last Airbender? Did you hate it? Or are you like me and it's somewhere in between? Let me know down below. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to unite the Claw Squad, and I will see you guys next time.